Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at competitive forces, but before we begin, I just want to remind everyone to subscribe and hit the little bell notification so that you do get notifications when I do post the videos, so you don't miss and you don't fall behind, okay? So today we're going to look at competitive forces, and then there's two areas that we're going to look at. One, we're going to look at the four types of competition, which is up here, and the second are the two categories. So we want to make sure we don't get these mixed up. So we're going to take our time and make sure that we clarify it really simple using some very specific examples. Okay? All right, so let's get going. So let's look at the four types of competition first. So the easiest way I find for you guys to help remember this a little bit, as you can see, I have a little acronym here, PMOM. That'll stick into your head forever, unfortunately, but it'll help you clarify and organize because it does get a little confusing. So let's look at the first one, perfect competition. What is perfect competition? Perfect competition is when you have two identical items. So for example, if you have a Macintosh Apple that you bought at Real Canadian Superstore versus a Macintosh Apple that you bought at the local fruit stand, they'd be identical, right? If I switch them around, they would taste and look identical, right? So that's what perfect competition is. So another example would say be a white Nike t-shirt. If I bought a white Nike t-shirt from say Sport Chek versus a white Nike t-shirt that I bought at Walmart, they are identical items, right? So they would be perfect competition, so you can actually match it. And a lot of companies, if you remember, like Walmart, Best Buy, a lot of companies have price matching policies in place, but they'll always ask you to make sure that items are identical, right? So what companies have actually done, and I don't know if you've noticed this, especially in electronics. So a company, say for example, Costco, if you ever try to price match a TV that you bought at Costco versus and try and find the exact same item at Walmart, there's a good chance you won't find it. And why that is that companies like Costco have gone to Samsung and said, hey, we want a 48-inch LCD TV, and we want it to have, say, two HDMI ports and three USB ports, and we want to sell it for this price. And they do that specifically so that when you go to Walmart, you can't find the exact same TV. Yes, you'll be able to find a 48-inch LCD TV, but it won't have two HDMIs and three USB ports, right? It'll either have two or something variations that are a little bit different, and the product code will be a little bit different so that they don't technically have to price match, right? And that's how they do it. And they have that power. These retail companies have that power. I mean, imagine getting a deal to sell something in Costco, right? You're talking probably $1 billion order. So if companies like Samsung say, no, absolutely, we don't want to run a specific line of TVs just for you, Costco goes, that's okay. I'll go to Sony. And do you think Sony would turn it down? No, absolutely not, right? So these large big box retailers have a lot of buying power over what companies make for them. And very specifically, I mean, at the end of the day, they're all out there to make money. And the more money they make, the more money the manufacturers make. So they're generally very much on board. So you see that's why it's getting more and more difficult to price match these days. But you really see that in TVs where there's not a whole lot of money to be made anyways. All right, so let's look at the next one. Okay, so let's look at Monopoly. We'll jump around back and forth, but it helps to make it later. We look at the extremities, right? So we looked at perfect competition. Now let's look at Monopoly. So what is Monopoly? Well, who here has played the game Monopoly? Right. So what is the goal in the game Monopoly? And if you said to control the entire board, you're absolutely right. So you need to think about yourself from a stance that, do you think that's good for the economy? Do you think it's good that companies have a monopoly over a certain industry? No, and that's why, and we'll talk about that in the next video, that governments are trying to discourage companies from having monopolies. That's why you don't see too many of them, but there's ways getting around it. Certain companies have done it in the past that still kind of have a monopoly, and if you look at gas companies, for example, right? Generally, at the end of the day, you will pay whatever the gas price is, or your parents will pay whatever the gas prices are at the gas pump. Yes, it may fluctuate a little bit, but at the end of the day, you still need to buy gas, right? But let's also look at electronics. We were talking about that earlier. Best Buy, right? If you think about where can you buy a computer, well, there are a few other ones. There's Canadian Computers, or Canada Computers, I think. Best Buy, and at one time there was Future Shop, and I don't know if you guys remember Future Shop, but Future Shop and Best Buy are actually the same company, right? They had a monopoly of it. So the government, when Best Buy came into Canada, basically said, look, you guys can't become a monopoly and own the entire market. If you guys remember what happened when that transition, you woke up one day and all of a sudden there was no Future Shops, and that was generally, I think it was about the 7-year mark. So they had a rule, basically they had to keep the Future Shop brand around because it's so more costly to run two brands. They eventually kiboshed it because legally then they can move forward, and Future Shop was no longer. But if you think about it, Best Buy has a pretty solid monopoly on electronics. Now, this again, when I talk about business, there's never black and whites, right? There is some gray areas in here. So Best Buy could technically fall under the oligopoly because there are different places you can get electronics. But as far as big box retailers, there is not one that's identical, right? Can anyone think of any other companies out there that have a monopoly? Think about it for a second, right? If governments don't want you, there's a good chance there's not too many out there, right? So there is one that I find interesting is LCBO. LCBO, basically, I know now you can get alcohol beverages at different retail locations, but for the most part, hard liquor can only be purchased at LCBO. Well, who owns the LCBO? Right, the government regulates that. So it's interesting that they don't allow large corporations to have a monopoly, but it's okay for the government to have a monopoly as long as it's regulated, right? So it's just interesting. I mean, and also keep in mind, what is the benefit of being a monopoly if you're a corporation? Right. If you said you can charge whatever you want for a product, you're absolutely right. And that's why governments don't want that, right? It's not good for the company. They want everything to be fair and equal. And we'll talk more about that in regulatory forces next week. But governments want everything to be fair, right? Fair for everyone to, become a strong company and continue to thrive in the industry. So they don't like monopolies. So that's what a monopoly is and why the governments and a lot of economists do not like it and think it's best for an economy in a Canadian government or any government for that matter. All right, so let's move on to the next one. All right, let's look at monopolistic. Again, jumping around back to monopolistic. So we've talked about the extremities, right? Monopoly, where one company has total control, and here you got perfect competition, which is identical. So now we're talking to here, when you're looking at monopolistic, you're talking about companies that have similar products, right? They don't have to be identical. So for example, we use the white Nike t-shirt. So if I'm looking for a white Nike t-shirt, maybe I'm not looking for it to be specifically Nike. I don't care. I just want it to be a white wicking athletic t-shirt. I don't care if it's Reebok. I don't care if it's Nike. I don't care if it's Adidas, right? That's monopolistic. So if you think about it, in this category, this is where the most amount of competition is, right? So if you wanted to open up a business, think about it. Do you want to be in this category? Right? Talk about kids playing in the sandbox. In this sandbox, there's a lot of kids playing in the sandbox. There's not a lot of toys to be used while you're playing in the sandbox, right? So here is where you really need to be creative if you're deciding to open up a product or a service that falls into this category, because it doesn't really matter, right? You can look at cell phones. Cell phone is a very competitive market, but there's usually the Samsung people of the world, there's the iPhone, and then there's the Android, right? So there's very few people. I don't just care what kind of cell phone, I'm kind of very brand specific. But however, in this category, people generally just don't care what it is, right? I want to buy an Apple. I don't care. Just go buy some apples. I don't care if they're Empire, Macintosh. Doesn't matter to me. It could be jeans. If you're buying different types of jeans, I don't care if they're Levi's, Calvin Klein. I don't care. Right? As long as I get a pair of jeans, pair of socks, are you brand specific? And this is the challenge that companies have when they get into so many different brands, is that trying to compete with other companies out there, because you're competing all over the board, right? I mean, if you look at electronics, with electronic accessories. You can literally buy electronic accessories like chargers and adapters, literally everywhere from Costco to Superstore to Best Buy to Shoppers Drug Mart to the local variety store. So all these companies, and even taking it one step further, is that you can buy all this stuff online, and that opens up this market huge. And that's why it's very difficult to compete and very difficult to be successful in a monopolistic market, right? So you need to have a really good marketing strategy and a really good business model in order to be really effective in a monopolistic. And this is the one you guys misspell all the time, but so it's monopolistic competition. All right. So let's look at the next one. All right. Last but not least is oligopoly. Oligopoly is when there's only a few firms, right? So some examples of that would be, think of it again, cable companies, Bell, Rogers, a few others, or there's a few companies, buses in Toronto. There's only a few bus companies. Trying to think of some others. Airlines. There's only a few where they can kind of get together and negotiate a price, and we can all still control the market. It's not like a monopoly where they have total control, but they definitely can get together and kind of kind of manipulate the market if they need to, depending on their relationship with each other. But yeah, there's only a few large companies that I can think of that fall into the oligopoly category. One could also argue that companies have gone from oligopoly to monopoly by buying up these categories, right? If you think of it, the role in the game of Monopoly, right, is to go around and you buy up properties. Well, certain large companies have done that. And in order to compete with these large retailers, I mean, I've already mentioned about Costco. I've mentioned about Walmart, how big and how much power these companies have. So the smaller companies around how do they survive, right? And if you think of the game of Monopoly, how do they survive, right? So there's always 4 players, and then usually guys gang up, and then there gets down to 3 players. And then this is where shenanigans start taking place, and maybe the 2 big players start picking on the one person, right? The person who doesn't have the best properties, right? They may have the railroads, and they may have a couple of the utilities, and they got spotty pieces all over, right? So they get together and to kind of muscle that guy out. Well, a perfect example of what's happened in the last 10 years is a company that you may know called Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire has been that third guy, and it's in order to compete against the big box retailers, the real Canadian Superstore, the Walmarts of the world, the Costcos of the world, those big players that have those good properties in Monopoly. They've actually purchased up small companies, so they have a whole different umbrella to help support. So they have all those pieces around the board in order to survive, and they keep buying up those properties. In that sense. So, and if you don't know, it's interesting. You should Google Canadian Tire and look at what companies are owned by Canadian Tire. So, if I would just give you a few, Sport Chek, for example, was owned by Forzani, but is now owned by Canadian Tire. Mark's Warehouse is owned by Canadian Tire. Part Source is owned by Canadian Tire. So all these different branches or different spots around the board, they own in order to compete with these large big box retailers. And it's interesting because we talked about how governments don't want companies to be a monopoly. Well, if you step back and if you know anything about the sporting goods industry, Canadian Tire actually was the largest sporting goods industry in Canada for many years, and I do know, still is. But since they've purchased Forzani, where now they own National Sports and Sport Chek, there's only a few small little independent companies out there, Played Against Sports, a co-op that is still out there, but for the most part, Canadian Tire has the monopoly on the sporting goods industry because they own all these other little companies in between. So they can kind of help manipulate the price and regulate the market on how well it does. But anyways, that's how companies are competing and trying to pull into that monopoly. So they don't have just the one brand, but they have many different brands. If you look at Coca-Cola, look at how many brands Coca-Cola owns, right? Some would argue Coca-Cola and Pepsi basically have a monopoly, but they fall under the oligopoly, right? They own tons. The chocolate industry very similar. Luxottica, with eyeglasses. They fall into this whole monopoly category. They own many, many, many brands, and there's a whole story on them. If you ever want to look them up on YouTube and look at the history that happened a few years back with regards to Luxottica. So, anyways, those are our 4 categories. So, again, to remember them, PMOM, so perfect, monopolistic, oligopoly, and monopoly, right? So those are your 4. Perfect being identical, monopoly being 1. And of these 4, right, who has the most amount of competition? Monopolistic has the most amount of competition in that category, or that type of competition, right? So monopolistic has the most, oligopoly has a few, but I want you guys to remember PMOM, practice it. I guarantee you it'll be on a quiz, so make sure you know it. All right, so let's move forward and let's look at the 2 types. All right, so the 2 categories of competition that we're going to look at. We're going to look at indirect versus direct and what the difference is. All right, so let's do that now. So the first one we're going to look at is direct competition. Direct competitions are companies that are identical. Very similar, very, very, very similar, so they're almost identical. I mean, obviously there are going to be a few little changes, but they're almost identical. So a perfect example would be, what would be a direct competition for, say, McDonald's? If you said Burger King, Wendy's, Harvey's, absolutely, right? You basically walk in, there's an area to sit and eat your burgers, fries. The layouts are very similar. Yes, the colors are a little bit different, but they're almost identical when you walk into the stores, right? Think about pizza. What would be some direct competition for pizza? Right? Yeah, if you said Little Caesars, borderline, they're changing up a little bit. But Domino's, very similar, right? Fast takeout. So they would be direct competition, right? If you're thinking about you want to order pizza, you really have a few options to choose from, right? But the process is the same. So in this case, I want you to think about who's direct competition for Home Depot. Remember, you're looking at companies that are identical. And this company that I'm thinking of is very, very identical. It's almost spit and image as far as the blueprint of the store. The color is just a little different. And if you said Lowe's, you would be correct, right? So if you walked into these 2 stores, they're identical. The layout is the exact same. The lumber is one side of the store. Their seasonal electronics and paint are in the exact same locations. They're spitting images almost of each other. The only real big difference are the colors, right? One's orange and the other one's blue. All right, so now let's look at indirect competition. So indirect competition gets really challenging, and this is what some competitors like. We talked about monopolistic competition. It kind of falls into this category. So you look at, if you want to buy a white Nike t-shirt, and keep going on that example for now, right? There's many places I can buy a white Nike t-shirt, right? If you start thinking about it, there's Sport Check, obviously. There's all other places, right? You can buy them at possibly Real Canadian Superstore. You can possibly buy them at National Sports, which is also ironically still owned by Sport Check, so it kind of falls into that monopoly category that we were talking about before, right? So think about indirect competition. So I want you to think about who's in indirect competition for pizza. Think about it for a minute. Think about where else can you get a pizza other than those fast food places, right? If you said Real Canadian Superstore, you'd be absolutely right? People forget frozen pizzas, right? And that's why if you look at the price of frozen pizzas in the grocery store, they're $5. $4.99 is that magical price. And what price can you get a pizza for a pizza? $5. I think the price is slowly creeping up now, but at around that $5-6 price range, they're almost identical, right? So they're absolutely direct competition, right? So think about that. So the same thing when you're looking at electronics, right? TVs. Where can you buy a TV? So yeah, if you're looking at a 48-inch TV, we used that example before. Where can you buy one? You can buy one at Best Buy, but where else can you buy one? Again, Real Canadian Superstore, Walmart, right? Not the exact same layouts, but you can buy very similar product, right? And remember we talked about they're not probably identical. In some cases, you might be able to find the odd one, but for the most part, they're not identical, right? So they're indirect competition. It's like paint. You can buy paint where? Home Depot. You can also buy paint at Walmart. And if you look at most of these indirect competitors, 99% of the time, they're going to be the big guys, right? They're going to be the Walmarts of the world. Because think about where you can buy everything, right? Costco, Walmart, Real Canadian Superstore, all these, and this is why they've done so well and why they're the biggest threat in retail, is because they're a one-stop shop, right? Where else can you buy strawberries? Well, you can buy them at Costco, right? You can buy them at the local fruit stand. You can buy them at Sobeys, right? The layouts of those three are not even close to each other, but they have the exact same product. And that's what you need to keep in mind. A lot of companies forget that, actually, look at the indirect competition, people that actually carry similar products and still compete with them. And it gets really challenging sometimes because there's so much competitor, and especially now when you're looking at online. Online throws this way off the radar. It becomes very, very challenging. So for this example, what would be a direct competitor for Sport Check? Yeah, I mean, most of you would be thinking about it. You think right away, you say National Sports, but I think I just told you that they're actually owned by the same company, so technically they're not competition. A direct competition, indirect, could be played against sports. The layouts are a lot smaller, so not really, so they could be that category. But an obvious one, where else can you buy sporting equipment? Real Canadian Superstore, right? They have very similar. You can buy shoes there, not identical, but remember, if we're looking for a white T-shirt, maybe even a white Nike T-shirt, Real Canadian Superstore might carry that exact same stuff. So they're in direct competition from each other. All right, so let's not get those two mixed up. So remember, we're talking about the 4 types and the 2 categories. All right, so there's an assignment for you guys to work on. Again, remember to hit the subscribe button and make sure you get the bell. And I'll see you guys next week.